Hello and welcome to this edition of Climate Talk on CGTN. Today we focus on biodiversity. Biodiversity loss and climate change are both driven by human activities and mutually reinforce each other. Neither will be successfully resolved unless both are tackled together. The UN Biodiversity Conference, or the COP15, has wrapped up its first part of meetings in the Chinese city of Kunming. It brought a joint statement to reverse loss of species by 2030 and pledges of funding to put global efforts on track. So to discuss more about the challenges of biodiversity conservation, especially how to provide necessary funding to achieve the targets, we're now joined by three distinguished guests today. Tang Dingding, academic member of the International Financial Forum, and Fang, country director of World Resources Institute China, are joining me in the studio, and also Mr. Terry Townshend, advisor of Paulson Institute, who joins us now via a video link. Well, thank you so much for your time today, ladies and gentlemen. So, as we know from the Kunming Summit, putting biodiversity on a path to recovery is a defining challenge of this decade. So begins the Kunming Declaration. So let me start with your comments on this declaration. What needs to be done further in the second part of the meeting as well? So, Ms. Tang, you go first.
Thank you. To me, I feel that Kunming Conference achieved very important good results. In particular, enhance the common goals and the consensus on the biodiversity conservation globally. But also during that meetings, give us a lot of important message. For instance, we need to enhance the collaborations with the financial sector. And multilateral, financial institutions needs to take more positive and active, important contributions to this biodiversity issue. Because everybody knows that our goals of the IG, formulated 10 years ago, not yet good, achieved. According to the review of that, implementation, in fact, 20 goals of the IG biodiversity conservation, no one fully, achieved, by the end of the last year. Therefore, everybody understands that more efforts and more political willingness by the parties of the Commission, government, needs to be more enhanced, but also more, stakeholders better working together. A kind of the partnership needs to be enhanced. For the next year, in fact, financial will be important topic for the next part of the COP15. And we hope that the new goals needs to be established based on a lot of maybe consultations and negotiations between parties. But of course, we need to set up a kind of, workable goals, but same times mobilize more resources coming from not only governments and the financial resources of the MDB, but also social and private financial capitals also needs to be mobilized on this topic.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Fang, Ms. Tang just mentioned we fell short of previous targets, but will this conference be a game changer? Will it restart global efforts in the next decade?
Yeah, that is a great question, since that is a COP15 is going to set up the future target in the next 10 years, 30 years, or even longer. So that is a good opportunity for China, especially after return to UN and host this COP15, the global events, to show the global governance capacity and also the leadership, especially when Xi Jinping announced that China will take the lead to donate the 1.5 billion RMB for developing countries on the capacity building for the biodiversity conservation. That is a really encourage, especially when the gap of the biodiversity conservation is still far from enough. So the Chinese leadership will show by that's the commitment. And the other impressive, when I was there, that is China is becoming more open. The parties conference telling story and show the China's experiences in biodiversity conservation using elephant immigrant from the protected area to the city and then back to the protected area. So that is really lovely. And also use the kind of the minority young women to show how they can use their kind of the group of people and using their knowledge for biodiversity conservation in the remote area.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, we're seeing some positive progress at the summit. But Mr. Townshend, I'd like to hear your comments on this. Are you more or less optimistic about biodiversity conservation after this conference?
I'm certainly more optimistic. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, in fact, there are, I would say, two really important advances in Kunming in October. And the first one for me is that leaders were engaged. So I think 9 international leaders, in addition to President Xi, addressed the conference. And to me, this is a really important step forward, because if we look back at the lessons from the climate change process, the initial agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, and the earlier agreements were negotiated by environment ministers. And often when those environment ministers went back to their governments, they didn't have the levers to pull to be able to deliver on the agreement. And so they don't have the power over the economic ministry, over the transport ministry, over the agriculture ministry, to be able to deliver. And so we only really started to see progress, real progress on the climate change debate when leaders were involved in Copenhagen in 2009, which ultimately led to the Paris Agreement. And I think we're now seeing institutional structures in government that bring climate change sort of out of the environment department and more into more central economic planning and policy departments. And I think that is essential to be able to deal with climate change effectively. And it's the same with biodiversity. You know, some of the issues that we need to tackle on biodiversity loss are related to agriculture, are related to infrastructure. And environment ministries don't have the power to do that. So it's vital that leaders take responsibility for this issue. And so it was encouraging to see 9 leaders, in addition to President Xi, address the conference in part 1. And I'd love to see a lot more leaders participating in part 2. So that for me was a really, really important element of COP15. I think another thing from part 1 is actually the extensive media coverage in China on biodiversity has really helped to elevate this issue domestically and raise people's awareness. You know, I think every media outlet that I saw was running front page and features on biodiversity, why it's important. You know, and I think that in itself is a really important outcome of COP15, because we really need more awareness among the public on this issue, you know, to the same extent that we have or is building on climate change. So for me that was a really important aspect.
So let's hope the second part of the conference can build on the success of the Kunming meeting. As Ms. Tang just mentioned, financial is a critical part in delivering these targets. And according to the UNDP, every year, no less than $143 billion are spent on biodiversity conservation. However, a total of $824 billion are needed. So there is a considerable gap there. Do you think it is achievable to narrow the gap, to provide necessary support? So Dr. Fang, you go first.
Okay. First, that is for the current situation. Based on the current situation, nowadays the government only pay almost 13 to 15% of the necessary fund to the biodiversity conservation. There's a huge gap. And based on the government expense, that is from the government, from ODA, and also from philanthropy. And the business only takes a small part of the supporting of the biodiversity. And the government money is never enough for the biodiversity. So it's very important how to wisely use the government money to leverage more social and business money to come in. That is a basic. So today we just launching a new partnership called the Partnership of Biodiversity and Finance. The purpose of this partnership is to set up the joint collaboration, and also from the government they can set up the laws and regulations and build up the market for the business to let them, when they invest in the nature, and they can get the financial return. So that is to make the whole circles sustainable, not just the philanthropy and the donate. And that is the first part. And second is for the financial sectors. It's quite important to have the awareness, put the biodiversity into their strategy, and also as well as the business. And also through the whole process of the decision making, take the consideration of the biodiversity and climate. Sometimes when you talk about the one issues, you ignore the other. So that is what we learned from the past, the lesson. And that is the lesson we learned from the past. We cannot mainstream all the biodiversity and the climate change into our business. So that is comparing to the climate change, biodiversity has a long way to go, how to mainstream the biodiversity into the different business sectors. So that is what my perspective. And the condition of the successful biodiversity conservation is supporting by the government, setting up the market situation, internalize the externalities, so make the nature value into their business and realize their value. And second, that is running by the society. So everybody need to realize that the biodiversity is related to them, it matters, since most of our food and our economy relying on the biodiversity. 52% of our GDP rely or heavily rely on the biodiversity and nature resources.
That's right. And as you correctly mentioned, there's a long way to go. So, Mr. Tang, how far are we now towards these goals?
In my view, this is a long way. According to the experience of the climate change, you can see after almost 30 years, still facing the financial gaps. That's why during the discussions and negotiations on the climate change issues, that is a very, very difficult issue. So same things for the biodiversity. I do believe that the next part of the COP15, financial issues will be the important, even maybe the first priority to be discussed during that meetings. And now I feel that there is no any important mechanisms to be established on the financial issues for biodiversity. GEF, Global Environment Facility, in fact, yes, that GEF covered the biodiversity, but the fund is belong to the financial and the public sector's contribution, not enough. Greatly, gaps now we're facing. So we need to mobilize more resources coming from, in my view, social and the private capital. Therefore, we need to see what kind of maybe incentive measures and the policies can be developed for the private sector. Let them do it voluntarily, not be forced by the governments or by the community. So therefore, I feel that a long way to go on this. But even so, I myself confident we will maybe achieve these goals in the sometimes near future.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Townshend, we know that the Paulson Institute is actively encouraging private investment in climate change and biodiversity goals. What do you think about the urgency to shore up funding and share with us some best practices in doing that?
Yeah, well, I think as the previous speakers have said, engaging the private sector is absolutely fundamental here. And we know that the private sector, will only invest if there's a profit. And the issue at the moment is that our economic systems and our incentives do not make it profitable for private sector to invest in nature or natural capital, as we should call it. So the really important priority is that governments must design the right regulatory systems and incentives that steer private sector investment. So we know there are going to be trillions of private sector investment over the next few years. And the vital thing is to ensure that investment is consistent with the biodiversity goals that we hope and expect to come out from Kunming. So things like agricultural subsidies, for example, this is a hugely important issue, where at the moment we're collectively, globally, paying people to use agricultural methods that are harmful to nature. And so one of the first things that needs to happen is we need to phase out or reform those subsidies so that we are creating incentives that for agricultural processes that not only produce food but also support nature. Yeah, and then there's the frameworks and incentives for the private sector to steer that investment for infrastructure and other areas, so that it's consistent with biodiversity goals. That's not going to happen on its own. So you might get a small amount of private sector investment going into biodiversity positive areas, but to be able to really steer the bulk of that money requires government action and government regulation. And so the agreement that we hope to get in Kunming Part 2 will be really important in terms of setting the goals and the targets and the direction of travel. But the real prize is that national governments have to put in place mechanisms to value nature appropriately. So that means really rewarding people appropriately who protect and restore nature, and penalizing appropriately those who destroy nature. And that's sort of a fundamental job of governments to do once we have the Kunming Agreement next spring.
I want to echo Terry.
What do you think on that?
Yeah, I want to echo Terry. There's one saying, best solution is prevention. So when we, on the one side, we feel we lack the money, but on the other side, if we spend our money in different way, harmful for the nature, that is a disaster. So I agree that when we think about our target, ambitious and practical target, on one hand, we need to increase the government MDB's investment at the first stage, and at the same time, we need to reduce or stop the harmful subsidies.
And it is very important to stop the harmful economic activity to the nature. And Mr. Tang, what do you think about the necessary incentives to encourage investment? What about market-based solutions?
I do feel that incentive policies and measures needs to be prepared and maybe issued by the governments, not only China but also all party governments of the Commission. Without such incentives, I myself feel that very much difficult to mobilize the financial resources from the private. Like Terry mentioned, private sector needs to get profit. Without such profit return, it's difficult for them to maybe involved in the practice of the biodiversity conservation. But same times, I do agree with Dr. Fang. I feel that prevention very much important. We need to use the approach of the prevention to minimize the potential loss and impacts caused by the investments of the financial institutions, like Multilateral Development Bank, World Bank, IFC, ADB, AIB. They themselves have very, very good policies and guidelines to minimize or to making the risk identification and mitigation measures needs to be taken for all investment activities. Therefore, I myself feel that incentives not only for the problem solving, but also for the prevention needs to be prepared and issued by the government.
And Dr. Fang, do you think the government should be more ambitious in providing green financing because the Chinese government is mobilizing financing resources towards this initiative that are beneficiary to the environment?
The government has many ways to use their money and also setting up the mechanisms. In China, plays a really good example for urgent protection or restoration the real or endangered species, such as China using the public funds for the redlining and return to from the agricultural land, farmland to the forest, back to the grassland. So that is China used 93% of the money of the wildlife protection from the pocket of the government budget. But in the following stage, it's really need to think about the kind of the systematic solutions after the urgent measures. And for the systematic solution, we should think about the green finance. Sometimes I tell my friend that green finance, we should doing things not only in financial institute itself, but also outside of the finance sectors, such as when we talk about internalize the externality, that the environment laws and regulation can make a new market and set up the new operation systems using climate and biodiversity conservation. And on the other side, the government also can use the incentive from the market to tax on those harmful activities and also give the reward for those benefit or nature positive activities. That is a market setting up and also the efforts outside of the green finance but supports the green finance. From the finance sectors, green bonds, green tools are discussed during this morning's PBF announcement. So that is a really interesting discussion. Many companies, as consultation companies, business people, banks are involved. So it's really need innovative ways to create a new system. We call it a systematic change.
Indeed. And Mr. Townshend, you just mentioned about the urgency of government to have regulatory framework to encourage this biodiversity conservation efforts. However, some countries have this regulatory framework while others may not have this policy. So harmful activities may be transferred from one place to another. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think it's the same with climate change, right? Certain countries you can reduce your emissions domestically and then effectively offshore your emissions elsewhere. So it's really important to look at the whole cycle, consumption and production, in both climate change and biodiversity. So I think absolutely, you need each country, both in rich countries and poor countries, to have in place a domestic framework that protects its most important biodiversity, that values nature, that creates the right incentives for nature positive activities and disincentives for nature destructive activities. I think in terms of developing countries, we know that, for example, some of the most important and valuable biodiversity, like rainforests, are in some of the poorest developing countries. So it is really important that richer countries help those developing countries to develop the capacity and develop those frameworks that are needed to protect that biodiversity, because that biodiversity is not only valuable to the countries that they're in, they're actually of global value. If you think of the role of tropical rainforests in regulating our climate and regulating the makeup of the air that we breathe, these are global services, global goods. And it's right that the richer countries should compensate those developing countries for stewarding, for looking after those global assets. So the fund that was announced in Kunming by Chinese government, that is really helpful in terms of making a good contribution towards that capacity building in developing countries, and I hope that other countries will come forward and help support that too. So I think it's that help to developing countries is a really important aspect, and it will be a really important political aspect of the negotiation. So I think in terms of the Kunming agreement that we hope to come forward in spring, ensuring there's enough support for those poorest developing countries that have that rich biodiversity will be really important in terms of getting their support for a new global agreement. So that capacity building element, I think, is a vital building block towards the agreement itself and also its implementation.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Tang, what do you think about the financial gap the developing countries need? Well, China just announced a $232 million fund for biodiversity protection in developing countries.
In my views, $100 billion, in fact, is needed globally. 1.5 billion Chinese yuan is a little, comparing with the demand of the, global biodiversity conservation. So therefore, we need to say why we need such, great money is coming from, because most of the developing countries, they do not have enough financial capacity to deal with, that issues, to treat that issues by themselves. And sometimes, in fact, most of the developing countries, they're facing the more serious biodiversity issues, biodiversity loss issues, rather than the developed country. Why? Most of the productions of the goods, in fact, now produced from the developing countries rather than the developed country. Developed countries already, in fact, pass from another, levels of such, productions distribution. So therefore, in my views, they developed countries needs to pay more attention, needs to pay more responsibilities, providing financial assistance to the developing countries solving that issues, including capacity building, demonstration product, and the special maybe technical transfer from the developed countries to developing country without any charge. And also they need to assist maybe different stakeholders in the developing countries making the demonstration, and then maybe the government can help local poor peoples, in particular vulnerable peoples, achieving the goal of the biodiversity from the local on the ground.
Mm-hmm. And the recent pandemic also affect developing countries disproportionately. So, Dr. Fang, what do you think what needs to be done to meet their financing needs for a green recovery from this pandemic?
Yeah, there's reflect to echo and Mr. Tang. There's a different way to link the developed country and developing country. And if we look at the world in the other angle, we think about the supply chain. Mm-hmm. It's a consumer and producer. So if we're using the idea of the supply chain, the whole supply chain could really think about climate change and biodiversity. And WRI World Resources Institute, we developed some tools. It's called science-based target. It's trying to ask the require business not looking at himself, but also the whole supply chain. Giving you example, like Apple, they announced 2030, they are going to achieve the carbon neutrality. So that is not only himself, but also the whole supply chain, from the supplier to the consumer. It's similar to biodiversity. I think that the supply chain can use for the biodiversity conservation, especially some eco products like food productions. Most of the deforestation caused by the food production and land use change, and forest is the kind of the rehabitants for the biodiversity. So if we really change the green supply chain of the eco products, it's really benefit to the supplier and also the consumer and producer. And it's really linked to the developing country and developed country. Normally, some developing countries are growing soybeans, palm oil, and also supply for the developed countries. So in that way, if the whole supply chain jointly together, we can achieve the ambitious target. We are very glad to see Vice Premier Han Zheng and Vice President of the EU, Timmermans, reach the joint consensus or joint communique on climate change and environment protection. It's mentioned about the supply chain and anti-deforestation, zero deforestation.
Mm-hmm. Well, we need more innovative ways to promote global cooperation on this issue. Mr. Townshend, we know that common but differentiated responsibilities is the principle for the global environment law. What do you think about equity in addressing global challenges? How to promote a just framework?
Yeah, well, of course, it's vital, and it's vital for many reasons, and I think it's important to also look at generational equity, for example. So what this generation, what my generation is doing or has done to the planet right now, we're leaving the younger generation with a planet in a much worse state than we inherited. So and their voices are underrepresented in negotiations and also in national decision making. So there are many types of equity, and of course we should be working as hard as we can to increase equity between developing countries, rich and poor, and generational equity as well. I think it's fundamental. But I'd just like to make a point on the biodiversity and climate nexus, because I think we're in this period now where we've just had COP15 Part 1, COP26 coming up in Glasgow in the UK on climate change, and then COP15 Part 2. And I think we're increasingly now seeing the messaging, especially from the biodiversity side, about the importance of tackling these two global crises together. And I think it's not just sort of that these are two environmental crises. There are actual big risks associated if, for example, you say, let us deal with climate change first and then we'll deal with biodiversity. This is so complicated, it's so big, let us do climate change first. Huge risks associated with that. For example, one of the biggest solutions to tackling emissions is clean energy. So clean energy infrastructure, solar, wind, hydropower. These forms of energy, they have a land footprint that can be up to 12 times the footprint of traditional energy. So if we don't plan that infrastructure carefully, we risk trying, with all good intention, tackling climate change, but undermining biodiversity. A lot of those renewable resources are in areas of pristine nature, and we also need the infrastructure to take that energy from those places to the cities. So how we plan that clean energy infrastructure is really, really important. We must integrate biodiversity into those decisions. And then also many countries have committed to becoming climate neutral by a certain target, whether it's 2050 or 2060. Now that will inevitably involve lots of offsetting. So there's no way all these countries are going to get their emissions to zero. So it will require a lot of offsetting. And one of the most attractive ways to offset emissions is to plant trees. And the public perception is that planting trees is good. And of course, planting the right trees in the right place is good. But there are many examples now where trees have been planted for carbon benefit, but they've been planted in other habitats, for example, wetlands, grasslands. And these habitats by themselves are also very valuable, not only for biodiversity, but carbon sequestration. So if we plant those trees in the wrong place, we could be, with all good intention, tackling climate change, but undermining biodiversity. So it's really vital that we bring these two issues together. And it's great today that you're talking on a climate program about biodiversity, because that's absolutely what needs to happen. So I just wanted to stress that point for the viewers at home as to why it's important to bring these two issues together.
Indeed, the two goals must be achieved together. What about your thoughts on that? Do you want to add some?
I totally agree with that idea. The climate change and biodiversity interact, and also we can achieve both, or we can failure both. So that is a basic idea. Since what we can learn from the system is to set up the long-term target. That means to give the market a clear signal. The government jointly have the political consensus will do that firmly and long-term, have the long-term effort. And second is a property right. In climate change, if we give the cap of the emission, it's similar to identify the property right when you have the action and reduce the emission, you can sell it. That's the property right clarification. In biodiversity also, it's necessary to have the very clear property rights, and also that is make the responsibility clear. And third one, when we address the climate change and biodiversity, it's really to put both of them, mainstream them into the sector, not tackling with one issue and forget the other one, or put one first and second the others. That does not work.
What are your thoughts on that, Mr. Tang?
I agree. In fact, in my views, there is very close relations between climate change and biodiversity. In my experience in Asian Development Bank and AIIB, I found that a lot of renewable projects, in particular wind power projects, that yes, benefit to the climate change, but may cause significant impact to the biodiversity.
Right.
So therefore, sometimes this is kind of the positive relations, but sometimes negative relations between biodiversity and the climate change. Therefore, in my views, when we address even one of that issues, we have to consider another one. Better ways is to put them as one issue, sister each other, and to implement that ideas as the co-benefit approach in order to achieve these two goals in parallel. That's in my understandings, and also we can efficiently use the limited financial resources.
And how do we enhance international cooperation to promote these sustainable development goals?
Okay, in my views, yes, that's why today we launching that partnership. We feel that the collaborations of the international community among different stakeholders are very, very much important. That issues for the biodiversity cannot be simply solved by the environmental group, and also similar, cannot be solved by the financial. So we therefore, hope that we put in all, that different stakeholders sitting together, collaborating each other. I very much happy to learn that during the forthcoming COP26, biodiversity will be discussed. So it means that the people of the climate change group, they already realize that biodiversity also is one of the issues relating to the climate change. So what I'm thinking, collaborations, in particular international collaboration between developing parties will be essential in order to achieve the goal of the sustainable development.
And we know that the World Resources Institute is working in many countries with many partners. How do you build consensus and promote cooperation?
WRI has 40 years history, and is setting up the first office outside the United States. China is the first one. And then followed by China, we have the India office, Indonesia office, Brazil, Mexico. We have the totally 14 international office. And we provide the common tools and scientific research globally to support each country to achieve the environment and sustainable target. Giving you example, that is for city corporation, we using the TOD, transportation-oriented development, and using that idea for each cities in the world, more than 100 cities involved. In China, in Yunnan province, Chenggong, new urban area, using that idea. We are trying to use the subways, railway station, and also combine or associate with the real estate the development. So the development and eco-conservation need some sectors to pay that. So in that way, we can find the sector benefit from the eco-conservation and pay for that. The people can enjoy the nature, and at the same time, when they go outside using public transportation and lower down their carbon emission. And we share the methodologies in the whole world. And also WRI provided a greenhouse gas protocol. We started research in 1998. Nowadays, the global wide using the greenhouse gas protocol. Mm-hmm. And the other example, we also helping the business people to set up the science-based target, and we have a 14 sector standards, helping them to set up the standard step by step, not just giving them the too high target and they cannot achieve. We're helping them use the tools.
Okay, well, last but not least, Mr. Townshend, could you tell us more about the cooperation between China and the Paulson Institute to tackle the climate challenges and biodiversity loss?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to give you an example actually, because when we're talking about international cooperation, I think this is, absolutely vital. So nature doesn't know, borders, international borders. Climate change doesn't know international borders. And if you look at ecosystems, one example is the migratory birds that fly all the way from Australia, New Zealand, up to the Arctic Circle to breed and back every year. And these birds cross about 22 countries, and right at the heart of that migratory route is the Yellow Sea, China's coast. The intertidal mudflats there are like a service station for this bird expressway, from Australia, New Zealand to Russia. And it's like a 5-star service station because it offers very rich food, and for many birds, this is their only stop on their way north. And so these birds, they're not owned by any one country. They're shared. It's a shared natural heritage. And with that shared natural heritage comes a shared responsibility to protect them. So, there's no point in protecting the breeding grounds of Russia if you don't protect the non-grounds in the southern hemisphere and the stopover sites in between. And that's why there's a partnership called the Asia-Australasian Flyway Partnership, brings together governments and NGOs and international organizations, of which the Paulson Institute is one. And it was very heartening in 2019 to see the Chinese government completely turn their policy 180 degrees from reclamation of these important coastal wetlands to protecting them. So they issued a ban on further reclamation of these coastal wetlands. They committed to protect the remaining ones, and the first two most important have now been inscribed as World Heritage Sites because of their natural heritage, and there are another 10 or so sites due to be inscribed in the next couple of years. And this was a real team effort across all these countries and putting together the evidence base for why these coastal wetlands are so important, not only for migratory birds, but also because of their role in carbon sequestration, local livelihoods, nurseries for fish, flood protection and so on. And so a calculation of the economic benefits of these wetlands suddenly meant that the balance of whether to develop these or not suddenly shifted in favour of nature and protecting these places. And I think that's a really good example of how properly valuing nature will tell you that these sites are really important and shouldn't be developed. And that was teamwork across the flyway, across 22 countries.
Indeed.
And that's the kind of thing that we need to see more of coming after the Kunming Agreement.
Well, hope we can see more such examples in the future, demonstrating what we can achieve as human beings together. Well, thank you so much for your wonderful insights. That's all the time we have for today. Tang Dingding, Academic Committee member of the International Financial Forum, and Fang, Country Director of WRI China, and Terry Townshend, Advisor of Paulson Institute for us. And that would do it for this edition of Climate Talk on CGTN. Thanks for watching. See you next time.